All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to start by introducing the first two people on the panel. So Dr. Adam Segal is the Ira A. Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security and the Director of Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an expert on security issues, technology development, and Chinese domestic and foreign policy. And next to him is Professor Elizabeth Stoycheff, who teaches journalism and new media for undergraduates, as well as quantitative methods and democratization at the graduate level for Wayne State University. Her research focuses on the role of new media in shaping international public opinion about democracy, media censorship, and press freedom, which is grounded in a range of contexts from the Arab Spring to Russia-Ukraine relations to NSA internet surveillance.
Sitting at the right is Jessica Zhanna Malekos-Smith, the inaugural Reuben Everett Cyber Scholar at Duke University Law School. Before joining law school in fall 2018, she served as a captain in the U.S. Air Force Judge Advocate General's Course. Prior to military service, she was a postdoctoral fellow in the cybersecurity project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfair Center for Science and International Affairs. She holds a JD degree from the University of California Davis School of Law, and she received her BA from Wellesley College in 2013. At Wellesley, she majored in Russian and international relations, and she was a fellow of the Albright Institute. She is currently finishing her MA degree with the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She writes in the areas of cybersecurity, international law, international security and defense, and science and technology. She has presented her research at DEF CON, RSA, NextGen at ICANN, and she has been published in Harvard Kennedy School Review, Defense One, The Cipher Brief, among others. We are very, very happy to have her join us today. Welcome back.
It's my pleasure to introduce Seva Gunitsky. Seva Gunitsky is an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto. His research explores how international forces like war and globalization shape democracy and domestic reforms. His book, Aftershocks, Great Powers and Domestic Reforms in the 20th Century, examines how hegemonic shocks can act as catalysts for bursts of domestic reform, thereby shaping the wave-like spread and retreat of democracy on a global scale. In addition to his relevant and timely research, Professor Gunitsky is regularly interviewed and quoted in various news outlets on U.S.-Russia relations and Russian domestic politics. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel. Stacie Goddard is a professor of political science at Wellesley College. Her research explores issues of identity, legitimacy, and conflict in international relations, most recently compiled in her new book, When Might Makes Right, Rising Powers and World Order from Cornell University Press. It examines the ways in which a rising power legitimizes its expansionist aims. Professor Goddard is beloved by her students and serves as a powerful role model in our lives. She supports student research, advises students, coordinates educational programs, and serves on numerous administrative committees, signifying her lifelong commitment to learning and intellectual rigor for all.
Thank you so much, Megumi. Thank you all to our guests. I am Professor Goddard. I am absolutely delighted to be here today on the opening day of the Albright Institute. Welcome to all of you. I hope your first day is going as wonderfully as it looked, and I hope you had a tremendous morning, and I'm looking forward to keeping the conversation going this afternoon. Before I just give a little bit of a substantive introduction, it will be small because I don't want to be doing most of the talking here at all. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the format, we're going to have 10-minute presentations by each of the panelists going in the order that they are seated. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Now, as a moderator, I, of course, come with my own questions. But as I said, I prefer not to hear myself talk. So I'm actually going to try to make it my role to get out of the way as much as possible so that you can press our panelists to ask questions and keep the dialogue going. But just a few words on the topic. Certainly when you have a panel, I think in this day and age, on authoritarianism and technology, one need not articulate the significance or the importance of that topic. Whether or not we're talking about Russia's use of technology and cyber technology, interference in elections not only in the United States but throughout Western and Central Europe, or thinking about China and use of technology in terms of surveillance and protection of the party, or thinking about, even just to focus on the United States for a moment as a democracy, the questions about the way in which media and technology is used to gather data about citizens or to influence debates. This is obviously one of the critical questions of the contemporary age. As I'm sure you already heard from your talk this morning, however, clearly this is not and shouldn't be thought of as a new topic. Questions about technology and governance and regime type have been with us for decades, if not centuries. Trying to think of examples myself this morning, thinking about going back to the late 19th century and the creation of popular press and the role that played not only in the creation of propaganda machines and conflict, but also in the ability of people to be able to resist and revolt against existing regimes, such as, for example, in the 1848 revolts that spread throughout Europe. We can think about the use of technology, such as radio, film, and eventually television, in the creation of use of propaganda, particularly in the fascist regimes of the 1920s and 1930s. So certainly this isn't a new topic, but it is one that seemingly has become more pressing as technology itself has become more popular and able to reach a broader audience. But even here, as we're talking about the use of technology, and a lot of the focus of today's panel is going to be on China and Russia, we're oftentimes talking about what is new technology, but with very old repertoires, right? And by that, I simply mean practices that are very much familiar to us. What Russia managed to do with Facebook and with Instagram might be something that looks very new to us, but really it's no very much different a repertoire than, for example, what the Soviet Union did very much throughout the Cold War. And technologies of surveillance as well have been with us, frankly, since the beginning of the modern state. So again, while the technology might be new, the practices are not. That does not make it, again, any less significant. So with that in mind, I want to go ahead and turn this over to our panelists. And like I said, we're going to go ahead and begin with Seva Gunitsky.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Megumi, for that introduction. Thank you, Stacie, for inviting us. I'll be quick so we can get to the Q&A. And what I'm going to be talking about is how governments use social media, how autocratic governments use social media for their own purposes. Before we get to that, though, let me ask a different question. Why do autocrats even bother to hold elections? Well, we can think of a lot of different reasons, and this will tie into social media in a moment. One is that they feel pressured by the outside, by the international community. In order to be seen legitimate to the outside, they hold elections, even though they manipulate those elections. But there are lots of other reasons that have really nothing to do with external pressure. Autocrats use elections to do things like shape the public discourse. Elections become sort of these pageants, sort of a display of party dominance. For example, by boosting high turnout, you show that the party is really in control through an election, even a rigged election. So it becomes a sort of celebration of party unity of sorts. Elections can also be used to gather information about public preferences. What do people want? Now, obviously, you don't get the real information because the elections are manipulated, but you might be able to get some sense of what the people are upset about or what the people want. And you might also find out which of your local elites, if you're the autocrat sitting in the capital, which of your local elites are more effective than others. Who is better, for example, at creating high turnout? You get some sense of who's doing a better job through manipulated elections. And people who've studied this have actually found that regimes that adopt quasi-democratic institutions, like elections, actually last longer than autocratic regimes that don't adopt those institutions. And there's some sources at the bottom, which I'm sure you can't see, but I'm happy to talk to you about afterwards, that have studied this phenomena very closely. But, of course, even fake elections are risky, because you might lose. You might experience protests. In fact, since 1945, 51 incumbent regimes have lost elections, rigged elections, even ones where they were well entrenched, like, say, Mexico in 2000. Not to mention you have things like the color revolutions, where a flawed election actually acts as a focal point for the opposition to mobilize. So even though elections bring some benefits, they also have some real risks. What if I told you there was a better way if you're an autocrat? This is going to sound like the infomercial part, okay? If there's a better way to get information about what your people want, if you can shape public discourse in a better way, if you can find out what the local officials are up to, and to do this without the risk that you run by holding an election, without the risk of protests, and to do it fairly cheaply, well, of course, I'm talking about social media. In many ways, social media accomplishes many of the same tasks that fake elections accomplish, but do so in a cheaper and less risky way. And of course, you all know that social media is a mixed blessing. I think there was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, everybody thought the internet was going to save us, was going to destroy autocracy. Moldova had the Twitter revolution. We quickly found out that's not the case. Autocrats are smart, they adapt. So they can also use social media for their own purposes. And one of the things they've done, in fact, early on, was censorship, to censor, to suppress, to control the flow of information. I think we're all familiar with that story. But what I'd like to argue today very briefly is this is going beyond brute force suppression. The tactics that are used by autocratic governments are going beyond censorship. And what we've seen over the last few years, I think, is a very important and major shift, the shift from social media suppression to social media co-option by autocratic governments. So what does that mean exactly? Well, in some of my earlier work, I talked about the various mechanisms through which social media can actually improve autocratic stability, improve autocratic resilience. And I'll go through these very quickly. Now, I'm just going to blow through these very quickly because we have limited time, but I'm happy to discuss any of these in the Q&A. So how does this work? Well, one mechanism is counter-mobilization. We see a young man at a pro-Putin rally here in the picture. When you face mobilization by protest movements, if you're an autocrat, one thing you can do is counter-mobilize your own base of support, right? Just as protesters can use social media to organize, governments can use social media to organize their own supporters. And not just people who benefit directly from the government, but ordinary citizens who might be motivated by things like prestige or ideology to support the regime. Vladimir Putin, who I'm sure you've heard of, said if the authorities don't like what's happening on the internet, there's only one way of resisting. The internet should be used as a resource to collect a larger amount of supporters. And he said this 7 years ago now, right? This is something that's been going on for some time. 2, discourse framing. What do I mean by that? Well, just like with fake elections, which turn into sort of a propaganda campaign for the government, social media can be used as a way to shape the public conversation. And moreover, it can be done in a way that's much more subtle, more precise, more adaptive than the traditional propaganda techniques that we think about. You know, you think about Soviet propaganda. I grew up in the Soviet Union. I remember the big posters, right? Very sort of obvious brute force propaganda. This is something different. Obviously, the idea behind it is the same, of course, but the techniques for doing it are now different. And Rebecca McKinnon, one of the scholars who studied this, says social media can be used to marginalize the opposition and manipulate public opinion much more subtly than in the old days. And we saw some of that even in 2016, I would say, although maybe I shouldn't open that can of worms just yet. We won't talk about the US election. At least I won't talk about it. Third mechanism, preference divulgence. Autocracies live in an environment where they don't know a lot. And in fact, they don't know a lot about their citizens' preferences. And that ignorance is partly self-induced by the way they maintain the rule, suppressing dissent, controlling information, making sure there's no public deliberation of grievances. But the effect of that is that they often have no idea what their people are thinking. And as a result, you have these situations where all these silent grievances turned into vocal protests overnight. It leaves the regimes vulnerable. So they would like to know what their people are doing. Social media, turns out, provides a great informational mechanism to let rulers know about the grievances and the desires and the expectations of the people that they govern. And again, to do so in a way that doesn't risk mass protest. Hu Jintao, the former leader of China, said, 2008, again, it's an important challenge for us to understand the concerns of the public and to assemble the wisdom of the public. Right? That this is actually saying, look, social media is not against us. Social media is something we can use for ourselves, right? 4th, elite coordination. Part of the problem when you're an autocrat living in the capital and you don't know what anybody's doing, you don't know what your local officials are doing either. And local officials have incentives to hide things from their bosses in the capital. If you're in the capital, you want to make sure that your local officials are representing you properly, are following your orders. If you're a local official, you have an incentive to show the facade that you're complying, but also to maximize the benefits you're getting from your office. So there's an informational problem here. And again, social media can help resolve that informational problem. For example, by allowing people to report on local corrupt officials. We see this a lot in China, for example, where social media is used to point out to some local bureaucrat that's abusing their authority, and then the central government can swoop in with a lot of noise and say, we're going to fix this problem, and we're going to show you that we're accountable. And of course, this does increase the appearance and even actual accountability. But that comes at the expense of broader reforms. If you're a citizen and you believe that the government is responsive enough at the local level, you may not have the desire to ask for broader reforms at the national level. So it's a trade-off. So what are the implications? Well, again, there are many sort of elements that come along with this shift from contestation to co-option that I've discussed. One is that we've had this assumption for a long time that increased access is trouble for the autocrats, right? Free flow of information means autocrats will be in trouble. Well, maybe that's not necessarily true, because they can actually take advantage of that information, not just the protesters, but the rulers themselves. And relatedly, seeing evidence of online debates or online discussion is not necessarily a sign of regime weakness. It may actually be a harbinger of regime durability. And there's a trade-off inherent in this. It may increase local accountability, but at the expense of more fundamental reforms. Moreover, being able to use social media for your own purposes, if you're the autocrat, can sort of inoculate you against external forms of reform, against transnational movements. We saw this in the wake of the Arab Spring, for example, when both China and Russia mobilized their own government-paid grassroots bloggers to protest against the Arab Spring and say, we don't want this kind of disorder, we don't want this kind of chaos. So it can be used as a way to shield yourself from the outside as well, and do so again in a more subtle way. I would say maybe in a more insidious way for that reason. People have talked about the dictator's dilemma. The dictator faces the dilemma, which is this. If I want economic growth, if I want foreign investment, I need to open up myself to the world. But that comes at the expense of something else. It means I'm open to people communicating, people receiving outside information, so I'm always facing a trade-off. It's possible that the use of social media by autocratic regimes helps obviate or escape some of the dilemmas associated with dictatorial rule. And this remains a problem, I think, that will only become more intense in the next few years. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next, we have Zhanna Malekos-Smith.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Rosalind. It is such a delight to be back here at Wellesley. I fondly recall my first day as an Albright Fellow. We were very excited for the start of the Institute, and all throughout the morning session, the speakers were telling us how excited they were for us and the adventure that we were about to undertake. So by the time lunch rolled around, we were on the edge of our seats, like, we're so excited, let's do this. So thank you, let's do this. Today, I'm going to offer 3 different snapshots of the political, technical, and the legal overviews of state conflict in cyberspace. I'd like to begin by drawing your attention to the fact that there is no standard international legal definition of what constitutes a cyber attack. Now, the closest that the international community has come to defining a cyber attack was in 2013 with the Talon Manual, and that was a treatise written by a group of governmental experts who defined a cyber attack as follows: a cyber operation, whether offensive or defensive, that is reasonably expected to cause injury or death to humans, or destruction and damage to objects. Now, being the sharp-minded group of Wellesley students that you are, you'll notice that this definition, well, it only references the loss of human life and destruction to physical objects. But what about harm to data? And this has been a common critique levied against this definition. How do you account for the destruction and degradation of data? But to present to you the other side of the debate, other theorists have stepped in and said, oh, time out here. The problem isn't that we don't have a standard definition of what constitutes a cyber attack. The real problem is that we don't have a general consensus on what bad conduct in cyberspace needs to be stopped. And with that, to add granularity to our discussion today and to encourage you to more critically evaluate the next time you hear a speaker discuss a cyber attack, I'd like to give you a framework so we can start having a more detailed discussion on that. Now, there are 3 different types of nonviolent political cyber attacks, and these were developed by Professor Thomas Rid at Johns Hopkins University. So if you're taking notes, here's number 1. Sabotage operations. Now, these are highly targeted operations that attack your adversary's hardware. So we're focusing on the system and the technology. There are no human operators that are targeted in this. It can cause financial harm to the affected entity, reputational damage as well. And a case study was in 2012 when Iran unleashed the Shamoon virus, which harmed Saudi Aramco, which is one of the world's leading suppliers of crude oil. Now, in this attack, the attack wiped hard disks of 30,000 computers. So it caused great financial harm to Saudi Aramco. Now contrast that to number 2, where we have subversion operations, where here the target isn't a machine, it's the human mind. Now in this type of operation, the effect is to undermine collective trust in societal institutions, eroding away social beliefs and values in that system. An example of this would be the Department of Justice recent indictments against the Russian operatives that were involved in information operations targeting the 2016 US presidential election. Last but not least, number 3, we have espionage operations. Now, there are 2 different flavors to this. There's traditional espionage, which serves a national security purpose, and then you have commercially motivated economic espionage. And what I mean by that is espionage that's performed with the intent to steal trade secrets, proprietary information, to confer an economic advantage to your home state. As a matter of public policy, the US does not conduct commercially motivated economic espionage. However, other states, such as China and Russia, do engage in this type of espionage. So having outlined the 3 different types of nonviolent political cyber attacks, question becomes, well, technically speaking, what then are the computer network attacks that do result in violence? And in 2012, Harold Koh, who is a former legal advisor at the US State Department, offered 3 examples. First, operations that open a dam above a populated area. 2, operations that target air traffic control, resulting in plane crashes. And 3, operations that trigger a nuclear power plant meltdown. Now, what you'll immediately notice with these 3 examples, they're referencing catastrophic physical harm. And again, I raise the question to you, what about harm to data? We can turn now to the legal aspects of this, and I will soon be addressing the brightly colored diagram up here on the board. But I'll start first by framing it for us with a quote by US Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. Now, this justice said that the right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins. Now, apart from sounding like a code of conduct for an 18th century gentleman's fight club, I present to you that this is actually a very useful lens for looking at conflict in cyberspace. When a state swings its fist in cyberspace and it collides with another state's nose, what does that look like? And more importantly, what legal rights are triggered as a result? And to answer that, we can now turn to the keyboard up here. Now, this juxtaposes the basic law of war principles with a piano keyboard to explain how states evaluate the scale and effects of a cyber operation and determine a lawful basis for resorting to a use of force under the law of armed conflict. Now, I use the concept of middle C and music intervals known as octaves to visually display the range of permissible state conduct. If you have a music background, you'll be at a slight advantage, but if you don't, that's perfectly fine. Not only will you master the basic principles of the law of war today, you also gain a little bit of music theory. So only at the Albright Institute would you receive both. Now, focusing first on middle C, just like when you're first learning how to play the piano, your traditional starting position is placing your thumb on middle C. Similarly here, your starting position as a state is to look to the United Nations Charter. Specifically, Article 2, Sub 4 states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. Now that's important here because there are 2 exceptions that exist to that. A state can employ force under Article 15.1 because all states are endowed with the inherent right of self-defense from an armed attack. The other exception to that is Article 39 of the Charter, which recognizes the Security Council's power to ultimately be the regulator in determining that there's been a threat, a breach of the peace, or act of aggression, and offering the aggrieved state a proper mode of recourse. Having defined the middle C concept, we can move out now to the green octave, which shows the permissible state action zone. Now here, the state has to assess, first in 2 steps, the amount of damage produced from the cyber operation in question to see if an armed response is justified under international law. And the second step is then determining under what basis of international law is that justified. And if the US is performing this analysis, we must ensure that the analysis supports domestic law considerations, the United States Constitution, and the War Powers Resolution Act. We can go out now to the yellow octave, which shows likely permissible state action for a range of activities that are anticipating the need for self-defense. Now here, the difference between permissible acts of self-defense and an impermissible act of preventative self-defense lies in the state's ability to demonstrate that the aggressor state was intending to attack it. So it's a high standard of proof, and there are 3 requirements that need to be satisfied. And these were developed by Professor Michael Schmidt at the War College, the Navy War College. First, the state has to demonstrate that the aggressor state was intending to attack it. Second, that the attack would likely yield those violent effects that we spoke about in the beginning. And 3, the victim state must immediately act to defend itself. So there's a temporal requirement. And if the state can't satisfy those 3 requirements, then the option is then to appeal to the UN Security Council and also explore non-forcible countermeasures such as economic sanctions. And we've seen that in the news today, discussing economic sanctions or imposing legal indictments, and also exploring other diplomatic efforts. Now, moving to the orange octave up here, we show the range of state action that is somewhat permissible. And the reason why I'm accentuating it there is because the identity of the attacker matters here, in that the victim state's response to the kinetic attack launched by a non-state entity will rest on issues of state responsibility. So what happens when the attacker in this case is a non-state actor? It's not a state. Well, the International Court of Justice's recommendation has been to evaluate whether the armed attack waged by the non-state actor can ultimately be imputed to the state. So the analysis is much more complex. In the interest of time, however, I won't be getting into the complexities now, but in the Q&A, happy to engage there. Last but not least, you'll notice that we have a red range titled out of range. These are notes on the keyboard that you cannot play and will not play. They're illegal under international law. For example, preventative self-defense, using force to counter a non-imminent threat. Or if a state were to employ armed force in response to a low-level attack in cyberspace, for example, cyber espionage activities, or a group defaced the victim state's government website, and then responding with armed force, that would not be proportional. And all acts of self-defense under international law have to satisfy the principle of proportionality and necessity as well. And what necessity means is doing your due diligence as a state to consider peaceful measures to resolve it before escalating to the use of force. So in sum, we've covered the musical scales here. A theoretical equation that I'll leave you to ponder for the Q&A is that for a use of force in cyberspace, what we have is a cyber attack plus violent effects equals a use of force. And I use a music analogy here to bring more participants to the table to discuss these issues. It's an important conversation that society needs to have. And as the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote, music is the universal language of mankind. So by doing that, we can bring more participants to the table. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you everybody for inviting me here. I'm very excited to get to be part of this discussion today. And I'm going to talk about government surveillance. But before I do, I want us to entertain a little exercise where we think about all of the technology that we voluntarily brought with us today that is capable of monitoring and tracking our behavior. So this is everything if you have a cell phone, a laptop, a tablet, a smartwatch, that video recording device in the back of the room, even the vehicle that you use to come to campus today has technology in it that is equipped for surveillance. And Dr. Goddard, in her opening remarks, mentioned the long history of surveillance. So surveillance is not anything new, and it's the technology that has really changed. And historically, surveillance has been expensive, difficult, and targeted. And so mass populations of a public were never the focal point of surveillance. It was usually targeted efforts because those efforts were expensive and they were difficult to obtain. Now that vast majorities of populations around the world have access to these smart devices that we go out and purchase ourselves, it is becoming much cheaper, much more efficient for governments to glean and collect data from the mass public in really a way that's unprecedented from what we've ever seen before. And one of the key questions and considerations that comes up is, well, why not collect this data? Because it's available to governments. They can then use this for a variety of purposes. And so I'd like you to think about what actually impact this has on the population. Because we're seeing mass surveillance in an unprecedented way, I think that it has profound effects for human behavior and the human psyche that are previously underdiscovered. So would anyone like to venture a guess as to how being watched or being monitored or being tracked alters your behavior? Yeah.
May prevent you from entering certain spaces.
Okay.
Feel unwelcome.
Okay. You have an example?
Maybe traveling and going through it, or
Okay.
an airport. for
Absolutely.
example.
Okay.
I mean, even a supermarket.
So
if there are video cameras.
Okay. So traveling to certain places, yeah.
Limits the groups that you can associate yourself with.
Okay. Limiting groups, association, memberships.
Limits the freedom of speech.
Limits freedom of speech, yes. So all of these are good answers. What governments will tell you they intend to do is actually they aim to enforce a mechanism of social control by trying to eradicate and eliminate behaviors that are either illegal or undesirable. And that argument is very difficult to argue with, that I want to live in a state in which I have public safety, in a country in which there is national security, in a state in which we have a strong cultural cohesion and morality. And so all of these things are very good arguments that governments put forth for reasons why we need government surveillance. And around the world, we have seen different models emerge with the use of the technology that we all own and have. China has been experimenting with a social credit system for a long time. You've probably heard about this recently in the media. It's kind of been all over. Other cities, especially Singapore, are emerging as smart cities, which sounds like a really great thing. And Singapore actually is the first city to try to capture everything that happens in the public sphere. So record everything that happens in a public space. So this increasingly requires facial recognition technology, and governments around the world are increasingly sharing their intelligence with one another. If there are particular surveillance laws that inhibit them from spying on their own citizens, they will get that information from other governments that then choose to do that. And government and intelligence sharing within governments themselves. So government agencies will share various types of information without the caveat, we don't know what it was collected for. So the overarching argument from governments, especially authoritarian governments, has been that surveillance is going to protect you. It's going to make our state safer, more moral. It's a good thing. And all of you who are good abiding citizens should have nothing to worry about because you're doing nothing wrong. And I'm sure you've probably heard that argument before. But the research doesn't really support that model, that we need intelligent and targeted surveillance to really eradicate crime and prevent terrorism, that surveying the mass population really doesn't have much of an effect on crime or terrorism whatsoever. But it does seem to have an effect on the psychological level of the people who are being surveyed. And what my research has shown in a series of experiments is something known as the chilling effect. And the chilling effect is a term from the legal domain, and it essentially is the deterrence of legal behavior out of fear that you think it's suspicious. So most citizens don't have a very good understanding of the law and the limits of what you are actually entitled to do and not do. And so any sort of sensitive behavior may come into question here when we think about types of behavior that may be chilled or deterred by the understanding that you may be continually watched, that your data is being collected, and that that data will be retained indefinitely. And we don't know what people are going to do with it. And through a series of experiments over the past 4 years, what my research has shown is that this chilling effect deters a lot of legal behaviors that everybody is entitled to do. This is a long list, and this isn't even the full extent of it. Several of you mentioned free speech. That is a core part of a chilling effect, that it takes away your willingness to disclose certain information about your political attitudes, your political behaviors in certain groups or just in general. And it especially affects people who are in the minority, whether it's minority opinion or a racial or ethnic minority. It also suppresses seeking out information. Again, something that we are all entitled to do. However, that understanding that you are being watched and monitored kind of instills this insecurity and fear in individuals that prevents them from better informing themselves about political issues so that they can indeed do some of these other activities up here, including voting. And I've looked at voting in states that do not require mandatory voting, and actually voting is seen as a good thing. As Seva mentioned, even authoritarian governments have voting systems, but people become far less likely to vote if they think that they are being surveilled. Joining unions or civic groups, and the most heart-wrenching one to me is willingness to identify with a particular identity group that they faced. I've looked at various racial and ethnic minorities. I live in Detroit, and so I've also looked at how Muslims in the US respond to heavy surveillance, and a lot of them have said that they are unwilling to try to identify as part of that group. They want to downplay that part of their identity, which is really distressing. And so all of this information, if you take all of these things together, they really kind of start to set up a formula for how autocrats maintain their power. If I am able to suppress all of these things, that is going to contribute to building my legitimacy and consolidating my power and my authority in my state. So authoritarian governments have a real incentive to try to suppress all of these things. And they are not doing this through any sort of hard power, through any sort of censorship. It is entirely just an effect that you exert on yourself because you know that somebody might be watching you or tracking your behavior. Now, I know I've painted kind of a bleak picture for you here. And so you might be thinking, well, how do we rectify this? What are some solutions? And one solution that I have is that actually more monitoring is a solution. But it's not monitoring of the mass public. It's monitoring of your government and government officials. And the key differential between monitoring and surveillance is that surveillance is very one-sided. Surveillance assumes that one person or one party has all of the power, and they wield that power. If everybody has all of the information and I have none of the information, that allows them to have the authority. Now, monitoring would open that up and make a reciprocal type of tracking behavior, so that we're making sure that the people who are watching us are doing so in good faith, in the public interest, and in the Republican models that they outwardly purport. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to our continued discussion.
Thank you so much.
So I don't have a slide, so I'm going to keep your attention by getting in your face. All right, so thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and enter this discussion. I'm going to focus specifically on China, because I think it brings together a lot of the themes that we've heard today, and I'm going to do three things. One is, why is China pushed so hard to shape not only its own digital space, but increasingly global space, right? When we used to think about China, it was really mostly the Great Firewall and keeping information out, but we've really reached this inflection point where China now feels like it has to shape the rest of the world as well. Second, I'll just go into a little bit about the tools that China's been using, how it manages to shape those things. And then three, I'll end with some uncertainty, right? What pulls China in different directions, why the politics might not be as simple as we think it is. The first, what China wants, right? And here I think it's pretty clear. China wants three things. The first is domestic stability and protection of the Communist Party, right? That's why it set up the Great Firewall. That's why it is constantly increasing control over the internet. Right? Ever since the beginning, when China first connected to the internet, it always knew it was a double-edged sword. It was going to bring openness, but it was going to bring threats to the regime, and you had to control the regime. Right? The second is technological innovation, and in particular, reducing dependence for critical technologies on the West. Right? China does not want to have to buy routers and networks and other technologies from the United States, Japan, and Europe. Right? It's a long-standing Communist Party, Chinese nationalist desire to reduce dependence on foreign suppliers for technology. And digital technologies, China thinks as a critical importance. And then finally is just national security, right? China for a long time believed that it had significant vulnerabilities to US cyber attacks, right? Disruptive, destructive espionage attacks. Long before the Snowden revelations, China believed that there were backdoors in all of the US products, and Snowden just reinforced that view, right? And so the Chinese believe that they have to have their own cyber power, their own cyber sovereignty to be able to ensure that it can both protect its national security and, if it needs to, project military force outside of China. So these are the three primary concerns, and this is what China wants from the digital environment. And then increasingly, with the Xi Jinping, we've seen this shift, right? Not just protect at home, but shape this global space, in particular because they see this as a space without rules, right? Or at least define rules. As Zhanna said in her comments, we don't know what the rules for cyber conflict are. We don't know what the rules are for data localization. We don't know what the rules are for who can gather information and who can retain it. And so China sees itself as able to shape this space immensely. So what has China done? The first is a set of domestic legislation and regulation. And we know that it's incredibly important for China because Xi Jinping made it one of his top concerns, right? He not only set up what was called the Cyberspace Administration of China, but he convened the leadership group on cybersecurity and information security, which shows you that it was going to be driven from the top, right? They were having bureaucratic problems in China, pushing forward policy, and Xi signaled to everyone below, you have to get in line below what we're going to push in this space. So we saw the promotion of the anti-terror law, the national security law, and then in 2017, the cybersecurity law. Right? Cybersecurity law says we're going to decide who's in charge of incident response. We're going to control certain types of websites and information. We're going to ensure that equipment that's put into critical infrastructure, like banks and finance and communications, they're secure and controllable. Right? We know where that technology is from. We may ask you for backdoors to it. We may ask you for encryption there. and a significant crackdown on the space for public discourse in the internet, right? And as Seva said, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, we would have seen the internet as a kind of alternative civil space in China, especially under Hu Jintao, right? There was, under Weibo, there was certainly a lot more discussion going on. A lot of it was the processes that Seva was talking about, was the central government used it to help them understand what the population wanted and control local government, but there was some real space there, and that is all gone now. Right? Xi Jinping has significantly erased all of that public space there. The second tool that China has used is increasingly technology, right? But commercial tools, commercial instruments. And China wants to define the next generation of technologies in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G telecoms. And Chinese companies are competitive in all those spaces. China is involved in international standards organizations and trying to define those things. And it has what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, right, which many of you probably know about. Not only investments in physical infrastructure, but investment in digital infrastructure. So we know that Chinese companies are helping rolling out the fiber optics, satellite, and other networks throughout the Stans, Africa, Southeast Asia, and other places. And as Elizabeth talked about, they're also exporting surveillance technology. We know of smart cities in Zambia that ZTE and Huawei set up, in Malaysia and other places. So they are exporting not only their technology standards, but also their technology practices and uses. And then finally, the third tool would be a type of cyber diplomacy, right? What does China want in this international sphere? One is, Zhanna very clearly laid out kind of international law discussions around cyber conflict, right? That is a very American, UK, Western European vision about how cyberspace should be governed, right? We have international law. We should apply it to cyber conflict. Well, that in itself is not a widely accepted or completely universally accepted idea, right? The Chinese have not completely accepted that idea, right? They did not participate in the Tallinn Manual. They basically, like the Russians, say, well, it might be international law, but maybe we need a new treaty, right? Cyberspace is a completely different area of space, and so we might need new treaties to control it. And we've promoted an idea, what we call cyber sovereignty, right? Cyber sovereignty is the idea that cyberspace, like every other space, can be governed by sovereigns, right? Like the air, the sea, and the water. And the cyber internet is not some global platform for free contact and free flow of information. It's one where states are always going to exert their own authority there. And so we see the Chinese diplomats working in the UN to give the UN greater control over the internet. We see them talking about use of cyber diplomacy and ITU and other ranges in their things. So a very active effort to shape the global internet, not just the domestic internet. Three senses of uncertainty where this is all going to go, and then I'll be done. The first one is just we shouldn't forget that there's still domestic politics in China, right? And implementation is always a huge issue on the side of what happens in China. So yes, Xi Jinping has signaled that this is a major importance, but we still have local governments that want to do things. We have provincial governments that want to do things. When you think about the cyberspace, right, we have the People's Liberation Army, the Ministry of State Security, State Encryption Bureau, the MIT. All of these are still arguing over who has control over spaces. And so also when Elizabeth mentioned Sesame credit score, right, there's all these reports in Wired and other places that there's one score, right? That's not true. Right? There are many, many different credit schemes being developed in China, some at the local level, some at the national level. Some of them have nothing to do with political control and are essentially just credit scores. Some of them are political, and so we have to think about all these things are going to take some issues to integrate and to bring out. The second is the role of Chinese firms and Chinese citizens. Right? So Chinese firms, as they globalize, should have similar interests to US companies, right, or other international companies, right? If you're a Chinese company, you really don't want to have to come up with technology standards or do backdoors for 193 different markets, right? You would like to have one standard that you can do everywhere because gives you scale, right? It's much more, it makes sense. And so you can imagine that the companies would have similar roles to Microsoft. Of course, that's not the world we live in right now, right? It's incredibly politicized. And so they're being forced, either forced out of markets like Huawei in the US and Australia and other places. And also the Communist Party is increasing its control over the companies. And so the chance for them to create distance between them and the parties growing smaller. But you can imagine a different future where the companies had more in common with Google than they did their own home governments. The other is Chinese citizens, right? And we have this assumption that Chinese citizens will put up with anything when it comes to data collection, right? Because they live in a world of massive surveillance. And it seems as if the Chinese citizens are fairly comfortable with the government having that data, but they haven't been completely comfortable with companies having that data. And there have been massive reactions to instances where Alibaba and Alipay enrolled people in programs and they rebelled. They said, we don't want that, and they were forced. And we have had massive data breaches where the Chinese public got very angry. So I don't think it's a given that the Chinese public itself always remains so tepid about how its data is used and how it's collected. And then the final uncertainty, which I will not answer, is quite honestly is US policy, right? How does the US react to all of this shaping going on? We know the Trump administration has put China's digital ambitions very, very high on its agenda. I suspect that many of you agree with me that it's not really going about it in the right way. But we can talk about that in Q&A.